Welcome to Small Arms Solutions. Today we have a very unique and very special video for you. It's basically a story that's really never been told. It's been behind the scenes. Unless you were really working for Colt at the time, you would have no idea of what went on. Many of you have already asked for throughout messages on this channel that you wanted some information on the HK416 and the program that went on back then. We will be bringing you some videos specifically on that. But what we want to talk about today is the actual development of the external piston rifle. To do that, we need to go back to the jungles of Southeast Asia, probably around 1966-67, when the M16 was having its first major problems. Back in those days, Colt was a very proactive company. They dealt with issues that they suspected were going to happen. They weren't as reactive as they are right now. With the problems that were happening with the rifle, they probably figured that there was a possibility that the Army might be looking for something going to an external piston like the AK-47, since that was what the rifle was compared to. So in 1969, Colt released a prototype for the Army. It was called the M16A2. Now, when I say M16A2, I don't mean the U.S. government M16A2. I mean what Colt referred to as the M16A2 in 1969. This was the definitive first external piston AR rifle. This was a truly piston-driven rifle. The lower receiver was the same as the standard, except for the fact that the rifles that were designed as the M16A2 back then, they had a four-way selector, a safe semi-auto, and a two-shot burst on it. The all difference was done in the upper receiver. The rifle actually had a long stroke system, similar to the AK-47, except the operating rod was not permanently attached to the bolt carrier. It was actually held on by a pin. And also what made this rifle unique was the fact that it was designed as a piston gun. The actual bolt carrier rode on rails inside of the upper receiver to keep it straight, so you didn't have to deal with any kind of a carrier tilt. The gas system was fully adjustable. That was done for a reason. The external piston operated systems required a lot more gas than the direct impingement, and you also have to deal with weather variations and climatic conditions, temperatures. So it was a fully adjustable gas system. The rifle was actually introduced by Colt as being an improvement. In fact, in the final report, Colt said that they believed it was an improvement over the direct gas. So now we're going to go towards 1968, the I-Corps congressional hearings. They figured out what the problems with the M16A1 were, XM16E1. They figured it out. They actually got the rifle designed and built for ball propellant, and the rifle was corrected after 1968. You saw very little problems. So the whole process of the external piston AR at that point was dropped. I do want to point out that at that same time as Colt was developing this, Olin was responding to a request from the government for a conversion to the M16A1 to an external piston. What this actually was a separate gas block that was put on further back than the front sight base. It was a short stroke tappet, meaning that it was a separate recoil spring rod as well as the carrier, and it was it was a decent system. But again, once the M16, the problems were basically solved with the propellant and issues with it not being developed and clean equipment and so forth, that too was dropped. So from there, we want to move forward to the early 80s. The early 80s, there was a company that first started off with external pistons, and that was Rhino. I'm not going to attempt this guy's last name because it was a really long and difficult Polish last name. But this gentleman here designed the first external piston that was actually sold commercially as the Rhino system. It was adjustable. It utilized a bolt carrier that had the carrier key swapped out with one with a pin in it. The Rhino was a short stroke tappet system where the actual operating rod struck the bolt carrier, driving it rearward. The system was not really successful. Talking to the partner of the gentleman who designed it, it was a very interesting story that it was shown to a gentleman from the Marine Corps, a high-ranking officer. And he requested two prototypes of the Rhino system actually being chambered in 7.62 by 39. So the designer of the Rhino system showed up at the Pentagon with 2 rifles in his backpack, oddly enough. And the Marine Corps looked at them and they started testing them. Well, Colt got wind of this. And this was more towards the early 90s that this happened. And basically, Colt claimed that they had the rights to the M4, and the only ones who were able to make any modifications to the M4 were Colt. So this guy was shut right out without even getting a fighting chance to even have the military take a look at his system. The systems were returned. I actually have one of those systems here. And the gentleman, he did make some sales to Olympic Arms for the pistols, but the Rhino system just sort of faded away as well. Now we want to go into the early 2000s, the SCAR program. The SCAR program was very interesting in the fact SOCOM wanted their own weapon. They were not too thrilled with Colt because SOCOM had several issues with the M4A1s. Some of them were due to some mechanical issues or some production issues with Colt, with bolts breaking and so forth. However, there was a specific need by SOCOM to have rifles that were significantly more durable due to the fact that of their nature of operations. They wanted the guns to be more durable. So they had approached Colt about making improvements to the gun. Well, Colt decided that this was a military TDP gun that they had to deliver to the Army, the M4A1, and they couldn't make any changes without the Army's approval. Now, the Army would not approve this because, according to the Army, they weren't having these issues because they don't run the guns the same way SOCOM did. Now, could Colt have handled this differently? Yes, they could have. They could have worked with SOCOM to develop something that was specifically to them. However, they did not want to go that route. So SOCOM was rather upset, and hence the SCAR program. Now, again, I want to reiterate that SOCOM wanted a gun that they were the project manager of, meaning that they could control from beginning to end. If they wanted to make changes, they could make the changes without authorization from the big Army. So as the program commenced, the FN SCAR rifle was submitted. At this time, they were all the 5.56 millimeter versions. They had to have the SCAR Heavy version on paper, but they didn't have to have any working models of it. So the rifles that were submitted were the actual 5.56 versions or the SCAR Light variations. Colt actually introduced 3. They had the types A, B, and C. The Type A basically was a direct impingement that was based off of their new one-piece upper receiver. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Type B was a standard upper receiver that could be converted with a ARMS SIR system, which was based on a standard direct gas impingement as well. The Type C was Colt's first external piston gun since 1969. Now, the rifle has absolutely nothing in common with the original Colt design. You also have to understand, too, that Colt does not have any of those old guns. All those old guns are in Reed Knight's museum. So Colt has had no, shall we say, a reference library for the engineering department. And reference collections for the engineering departments are very critical for a gun manufacturer because you need to know what you've done before as to what you're doing now. That prevents you from doing a lot of things over again. For instance, looking at piston systems, having know what was done before to apply to the next. So Colt had to start over from scratch when they developed this Type C. So what we're going to talk about really right now is the Type C. Now, the lower receivers on the Types A, B, and C were the same. The upper receivers on the Types A and C were the same. The difference between the A and C was the actual operating systems themselves. So the Type C, discussing the lower receivers, as you'll see from some photographs on this video, you will see that the selection lever is very different. It actually mimics that of a 1911. It was interesting, to say the least. On the left side, you'll notice there was a Norgon ambi catch, and basically the lower receiver was the same except for it used an H2 buffer. They also chose to go with the Voltor mod stock, which Colt uses today. Many companies do today. It's a standard. It's one of my favorites as well. But we also want to talk a little bit about the finish of the gun itself. The rifles had to be Coyote Tan or flat dark earth, whatever you want to call it. But Colt was experimenting with another finish at that time called UCT or Ultra Chemtech, I believe it was. It's very similar to what we have as the Fail Zero today, but a much earlier. This is going back to 2003. This was supposed to be, at the time, a lubeless finish. Now, this nickel boron type finish was applied to all three rifles, A, B, and C, to the entire rifles, not just the bolt carriers and the fire control groups, but the upper receivers, lower receivers, all the components, and then it was painted over with the coyote tan, or whichever color you want to call it. Now, the gas system on the Type C was very interesting, as you're going to see again from some of the pictures in here. It was a very simple short stroke tappet. You had the actual operating rod, and then you had the actual gas cylinder itself. Very simple. The one major complaint with that gas cylinder was it was not removable for operator maintenance. The actual gas cylinder was pinned in place, so there was no way for the end user to take it out and clean it. Now, according to Colt at the time, they basically said it didn't need cleaned, but I think anybody's naive to say that anything you don't need to clean. It's a totally unrealistic for any type of a small arm, to say the least. So with that not being removable, then the actual bolt carrier itself, as you'll be able to see also from the video, the bolt carrier basically was a standard M16 full auto carrier that was coated in the UCT, and it was machined out, and the carrier key was put in, it was screwed in place, and it had an actual pin that went from the carrier key into the bolt carrier, and that was what actually was used to push the carrier back. So we're going to move forward into the actual trials. The trials themselves were interesting because if you were to talk to people who were involved with them, you got a couple different stories. One of the stories was the FN was the clear winner. Several others said that the Type C and the FN were on par with each other, and some actually claimed that the Type C was better. I will say this, regardless of what happened, I don't think that there was any way Colt was going to get this contract from the get-go. SOCOM made it pretty clear they were unhappy with Colt. So I think regardless of how well the guns came through, it just wasn't going to happen. Also from my experience, or from my talking to people who were involved in the testing, the two Colt direct gas guns came through the test just as well as the piston guns did. But it wasn't written in the requirements that it had to be an external piston, but it was pretty much implied that was going to happen. So in the end, the FN SCAR won, and the Colt piston gun sort of drifted away until around 2000, probably around 2002, 2003. On the onset of the global war on terrorism, Special Forces again came out with a report stating that the M4 was, quote, fundamentally flawed due to its gas system, basically saying that they, quote, shitware at 8, meaning the external or the internal piston. I also want to clarify something too, is I don't like using the term direct impingement versus piston gun, because the direct gas is also a piston gun. The difference is in a direct gas gun, the piston is actually in between the bolt carrier, rear of the bolt carrier, and rear of the bolt. That's the expansion chamber. That's an internal piston, where the long stroke and short stroke are external pistons, where the op rod's outside of the receiver. There was claims that it was fundamentally flawed, and H&K come out with the HK. At that time, it was called the HK-M4. And that was developed by H&K along with some members of U.S. Special Forces as a improved system that was supposed to be better than the current M4 system. HK went on a very aggressive campaign, got several writers involved, from everybody from Defense Online to several of the military publications, and it was pretty ugly. They had posted articles. One was a better rifle and you can't have it. It basically was articles that were telling soldiers that they were giving an inferior weapon. So Colt, in the background, commenced with a new piston program. Now, Colt is very well known for doing things super secret in the background, to the point of a fault. because it always would appear as Colt was doing nothing. They were just sitting still. So as they're developing these programs behind closed doors, not letting anybody know that they're working on it, I think it very much hurt Colt's reputation for innovation at that time. So at that time, they took the SCAR rifle, the SCAR Type C, and they proceeded to make some improvements on it. And the direct result of that was called the Colt LE1020. And this is the rifle I have here. This is actually one of the most valuable rifles in my collection because, to my knowledge, it is the only LE1020 that ever left Colt or Colt Canada. This rifle never actually went into production. How it came into my hands was before I went to work for Colt, I had worked with them a little bit on some of their PR issues. As being a Colt historian, I had debunked several of the false claims that were made against it, and General Keyes, he asked me if there was ever anything I wanted from Colt, and I had said, I want an LE1020. So he personally had Art Daigle, who is the head model shop guy, probably one of the most gifted model designers in the industry. He made this for me, and this upper receiver was made by hand. This was not ever in production. This was made in the model shop. You can actually tell by machining on it, it was not a refined, finalized design. But this is the rifle that Colt actually showed in several of their trade shows, but it was shown as Colt's capability to produce a piston gun. This rifle caused a lot of stir in both commercial and military markets alone. Commercially, because of the publicity that was given to the you need to have an external piston gun over a direct gas because it's far more reliable, there was a big outcry for it in the commercial market. And in the military market, there was, again, a lot of attention being given to the HK416, and it became a pretty heavy fight between the 416 and the M4. As the battle ensued between Colt, HK, and SOCOM and the Army come out with a public statement that said that according to the Army, the M4 meets and exceeds all of its expectations and its performance criteria, and the Army was happy with it. Where you would hear reports coming in from SOCOM of failures, everything from broken bolts to barrels that are ruptured, reliability issues, failures to extract, issues that were caused because of gas port erosion, everything. And these stories were coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq as well. So again, these particular authors, they attacked the M4 at every turn. The Department of Defense or orders up at Picatinny were asked to do 2 extreme dust tests. One in the summer of 07 and one in the fall of 07. I have to use my cheat sheet here because of the numbers. There was a very interesting discrepancy between the findings of the M4 between summer of 07 and fall of 07. First of all, we're going to take a look at just at the M4 scores alone. In summer of 07, M4 Dust Test 2 experienced 296 stoppages. Now we go to fall of 07. The M4 Test 3 experienced 863 stoppages. This is a major discrepancy. This basically says that the test was not done scientifically. It was not done properly because you have a repeatability in those. If this was a true issue with the firearm, you would have repeatability in these tests. And this never made any sense. However, HK as well as these authors use these numbers to tell the Department of the Army and also Senator Coburn, who sent a letter to the Department of the Army saying that perhaps there's a better weapon than we don't have it. So let's do a bit of a comparison in between the rifles that it competed against. There was no data made available from summer of 07 for the XM8, HK416, and Mark 16 or FN SCAR. But in the fall of 07, again, we'll say that the M4 did 863 failures as they claimed. The XM8 had 116 failures. The HK416, 219, and the FN SCAR 16 was 210. Now, if we take those numbers from summer of 07, which was 296 failures, the M4 was not too far off of the XM8, 416, and the FN SCAR. We also have to look into the fact, too, is the M4. Colt looked into the serial numbers that were used on those guns. Those were older firearms. Those were not new production M4 carbines. The XM8, the 416, and the FN were all brand new firearms using brand new proprietary magazines. and they were compared against the M4s, which were well-used rifles. So this test was not done scientifically, and I can tell you from seeing tests myself over the years that there's a specific way these tests have to be done, and the information is repeatable. So for as far as the legitimacy of those tests, I highly question them. I'm not saying that the M4 was better than those guns or whatnot. I'm saying there should have been consistency in between the numbers between the two. There's a lot of pressure that was coming out. We're going to take a look at the the LE1020 right now. Around 2006, 2007, Colt decided to get heavily underway on developing the new piston carbine that they were going to have just in case there was an issue with the military asking for a piston carbine. Colt engineering department basically took two teams. One team worked on what was eventually labeled the LE1020, and the other team went to work on what was called the M5. So they were two different external piston operated rifles. The LE1020 was designed by Colt's late Mike LaPlante and Art Daigle, and the M5 was designed by Colt's Greg Kuczynko. The rifles were quite different. The LE1020 was based off of the one-piece upper receiver and the Type C. The M5 was based off of a standard upper receiver with an external piston mechanism. It had some neat features on it as well. Right around the 2007 time period, when the prototypes were done of both, I visited Colt and I sat with Dennis Vayu in his office. At that time, he was the head of engineering, and he had asked me my opinion of the two rifles. Colt stopped listening to me after they hired me, but before they hired me, they actually listened to me. And I basically told them that I was quite fond of both rifles, that there were some features on both that I thought that should be combined into one. That actually wasn't done. The rifles remained totally separate from each other. When they did this, though, I think it was probably a very bad idea to have two teams rather than one cohesive team, because it caused a lot of problems with the engineering teams themselves. There was a lot of negative feelings that still exist today between the two teams. One of the teams claimed even that there was sabotage to make their gun look bad. It was an all-around bad experience, I felt, in putting these two teams against each other. But in the end here, the LE1020 was the basis for the final design. Now, looking at this LE1020, this was the 16-inch semi-automatic only version. Prototypes were made in the short 10.5-inch barrels. They were made in 14.5, 16. Selective fire, of course. The 1020 got rid of the 1911 style selector lever. This particular rifle, again, as far as I know, the only one to ever leave Colt, is a perfect example of the rifle that they showed at SHOT Shows for several years as their proof of capability of making a piston gun. We're going to go over this pretty much from the butt to the muzzle on it. Again, semi-automatic only. The lower receiver is a standard what you would have on like an LE6920. It did have an ambidextrous safety on it. Due to this being an external piston, in the dynamics, it utilized an H2 buffer. Now, this upper receiver was designed really early on. This was really the earliest days of the LE1020. It still utilized the UCT finish of the Scar C. However, it's black. The UCT is underneath the black finish. The entire upper receiver is coated in UCT. And then it has black paint over it. If we look at the bolt carrier itself, this was the second generation Colt bolt carrier. We'll take a close look at that. As you can see, the entire bolt carrier is all in UCT. You can see that there's two screws on the top. Basically what this was they changed from the original Type C design where they actually cut into the bolt carrier to using a standard bolt carrier, modifying the hole, inserting a steel pin up in the front here, and then screwing these down. So as the operating round would come back and strike it, it would blow it back. So they utilized, again, the UCT finish. Once they found that the UCT finish was not what they wanted, or it wasn't as all they thought it was going to be, they switched to this exact same design in a manganese phosphate finish. Now, when the first LE6940Ps or their piston guns left Colt's facility for sale to the public or commercially, it actually utilized the manganese phosphate version of this. However, they found out very soon that this was not durable enough. They were going to have to change that design. So the third generation bolt carrier utilized the same type of carrier key system, but it ended up omitting all the gas ports. And I actually don't know if I've ever seen any of them provided with this bolt carrier. This is a carrier that was given to me when I got the LE1020 as a third generation, I guess you would call it. I don't ever recall seeing this one being put in any of the LE6940Ps. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Looking inside of the receiver, very much so like the SCAR Type C, the hammer trigger mechanism was all UCT coated as well. This was very good for the friction on the components. And looking at the other side, you also see we have the ambidextrous magazine release. Another feature that carried over with this one onto the commercial was the Otis pistol grip cleaning kit. The Type C SCAR utilized Otis's grip kit. So when this one was built up, it utilized the same components that were used in the Type C SCAR. This, however, did not convert over to the 6940P, but this was a very neat feature that was added to the SCAR C. Now we're going to actually take a look here at the actual operating system itself. The actual lower handguard is removable, so you can install the M203 grenade launcher. So when Colt says one-piece upper receiver, I really hate saying one piece because there's actually two pieces. The only true monolithic upper receiver is the LMT MRP, which is solely one piece, where the barrel actually slides in from the front rather than have a removable handguard. The front sight base is actually machined out of a billet of steel. As you can see, there's two gas ports to bleed off excess gas. The front sight is actually folding. It's held up by a detent, and you just flip it back down. That's all there is to it. The gas system itself, due to people at SOCOM complaining about not having the ability to actually take out the operating system to clean it, a detent was made, pulled right out, and it's held captive. And now you actually have the operating system itself. You have the actual piston itself, and you have the operating rod, piston, and the basically this would be the expansion chamber or gas plug. Now this is a prototype, so this one only has one gas setting. The final version is actually you'll be able to flip over to have a suppressed and an unsuppressed position. If you notice here that you actually have a pyramid-shaped piston. This was basically done because they felt that it would more evenly distribute the gas to push it back than a flat one would. You also notice there's no gas rings on this whatsoever. The rear is actually UCT coated, and you do have a spring on there as well. There really is nothing special about this operating system. I mean, there's not all that much that you can actually do with a short stroke tappet. You can depend on the way things would vent or whatnot, but basically these are all similar. If you notice that you do have a bayonet lug on here as well. Now the barrels are just the typical Colt mil-spec barrels, which they modify the gas ports for the external piston. Now, one of the issues that comes up with external piston guns in these as well is you will have an area right behind the cam pin slot, which will actually get damaged due to the operating dynamics of the piston. It opens up much more violently, and it actually the cam pin will cut a groove into here. This was found on all the Colt piston guns, and it's been found on every piston gun since. Anybody who has ever designed this gun, for the most part, tried to turn a M16 or AR-15 type system into a short stroke tappet or any other kind of a piston system has experienced that. Generally, it only goes so far. Doesn't really cause a lot of mechanical issues, but it does cause problems. And Colt would correct that in the advanced piston rifle, which we'll take a look at in a minute. So this gun was demoed on occasion, but Colt never ever sold it. And this goes to another issue during that time period. There was a lot of demand for this gun commercially. However, Colt would just not release it. That all was a strategy that Colt had. I categorically disagree with this stance that Colt had on it. They would not introduce this piston gun into the market because during the fight with the M4 carbine versus the HK416, executives at Colt felt that if they were to introduce a piston system, that they would be admitting that there was something that was better than their direct gas M4 carbine, which I totally disagree with. They should have offered this as an option. You're not, in my opinion, you would not be admitting there's any fault with the M4 carbine. But if a customer was to want an external piston operated gun, you provide it to them. By Colt taking that high road, if you will, by not offering the external piston gun, all they did in the end was they created a market for Patriot Ordnance Factory, HK, Primary Weapon Systems, to just name a few companies, to produce external piston rifles and to take all that money and business away from Colt. So in spite of that idea that they would be admitting to something, Colt lost a lot of business. They fell way behind on the development of the external piston rifle, and when they did enter into that market, which wouldn't be until I would probably say I would say around 2012 maybe, in that area in there. That's when they would actually introduce the external piston gun for sale. They were one of the last ones to introduce it. Other weapons manufacturers had these guns in military service throughout the world. They had combat records, and when Colt would actually introduce, they were way behind the eight ball. But there's a couple ways they could have handled the situation differently between the M4 and the HK416. Colt, the way that they handled that situation was very arrogant. Since the Army came out with that letter that stated that, the M4 meets and exceeds all of our criteria and our mechanical needs, the Colt basically always fell back on that letter. When they actually had the incidents that were happening with the rifles malfunctioning in Afghanistan and Iraq, if they would have gotten off their asses and sent somebody over there to see what actually happened over there, because there was issues. There was rifles that failed. And I was over in Afghanistan, and I did actually have a chance to look at a whole bunch of rifles, and I looked at a whole bunch of parts. And I have my own theory on what one of the main problems was with this gun over there. And in my opinion, that was due to second, third, and fourth echelon manufactured components. I had run into a lot of spare parts over there that you could not even put into the rifle. I had bolts that I had seen over there in an arms room that you could not even insert bolts into the carriers with cam pins because the parts weren't manufactured properly. I saw rifles from the Air Force actually that you had a difficult time even pulling bolts back because the stack of tolerances were so high that I doubt the rifles even worked. There were other issues that did come up that caused problems with the rifles. If Colt would have sent somebody over there to investigate what was going on, they would have seen this. Because there was nothing wrong with the M4 carbines that were over there. But enough on that soapbox. Now we're going to go to the final version of what's introduced today, which is called the LE1020P, or piston gun, or the APC, or advanced piston carbine. If you were to buy one today, this is what you would actually buy. This rifle is highly modified from the LE1020. This thing went through a lot of changes, a lot of improvements. We'll first look at the lower receiver itself. This is again a current LE6940 lower receiver. Now I had actually changed this lower receiver. This rifle comes with a lower receiver that says Colt LE piston carbine. I think that is an absolute ridiculous name for a rifle, calling it a piston carbine. First of all, the direct gas is also a piston carbine. It's an internal piston instead of an external piston. So the lower receiver I have for this is just as the standard M4 carbine. Something else I want to point out on the lower receiver is where it says safe and fire. This was actually done by me while I was at Colt. I had put in two requests for changes with engineering department Due to the fact that every manufacturer had on the right side safe and fire, and Colt didn't, I felt that it should be on there. So I put in two requests. One was to put safe and fire on the right side, and one was to change the selector so you actually have this notch on it. Well, in Colt's infinite wisdom, they approved to put the safe and fire, but they did not approve this change. Basically, they said because the selector lever was reversible, that it was not necessary to have this because you would just reverse it. Well, the whole point of having the safe semi burst or whatever on the right hand side was so if you were a left-handed shooter, you would be able to tell which condition your rifle was in visually. So by Colt not putting the notch on there, you couldn't do that anymore. So I have no idea why they approved one without the other, but probably in my 3 years at Colt, this is one of the only things I was able to get through. Looking at the rear here, Colt changed after they lost the government contracts. When they were trying to go more towards the commercial and LE market, they went to the Rogers stock here. Basically, you have a lock. Of course, Colt puts their name on it as well. Again, the upper receiver or lower receiver is a standard LE1020 current production, but the upper receiver is where we're going to start taking a look at some of the changes. Now this, like the 1020 before, it has a H2 buffer. Looking here, you're able to see that they went through an evolution of bolt carrier. As you can see, they went from having the pinned-on gas block, which was found to break, to a one-piece. So this is the current production one piece. Much more stronger, much more durable. This was a major reliability enhancement for the rifle. The upper receiver, it's had some modifications to it as well. We spoke previously with the 1020 and the rifles before that about how, due to the operating characteristics of the external piston version of these rifles, the cam pin would actually dig into the receiver behind the cam pin slot. Colt has added a metal block in here, and this actually protects the receiver from being damaged. Very interesting story on this as well. This actually had come from me, believe it or not. While I was my earlier days at Colt, I was working with Phil Hinckley. He was at the time the head of engineering. We had seen this. I had seen this the problem, and through my research, I had seen the final report from Winchester in 1969 on their external piston conversion. Well, back in 1969, Olin saw the fact that damage was happening as well. So what Olin did was they actually put in a steel screw. They drilled a hole into the side of the receiver, as you can see here, and they put a steel screw in there that did the exact same thing. So he took that, and Colt redesigned what Winchester had done into an actual metal stop rather than just a screw. Colt has since put this on all their upper receivers, whether it be direct gas, piston. Also, their new 308s, the LE901s, has that as well. But yeah, that actually came out of Winchester in 1969. So that was a very good enhancement. Now the upper receiver here, which you will see is a final production. The exact same upper receiver is used for the DI as well as the piston guns. So it's the same upper receiver. The only difference is what barrel you put in. Now if we compare this front sight base to the original, which we're going to do right now, there were some changes that were made. This is actually manufactured of a forging, rather than this being fully machined out of a block of steel for production use. This one has one vent hole instead of two. Both have bayonet lugs. The biggest change has to do with the actual front sight itself. If you were to notice, you now have a lock on the front sight. This was requested by the customers, military customers and civilian customers alone, because it would get knocked down if it was bumped. Now also the piston itself, the operating rod, has gone through an evolution as well. The difference is now that Colt has what they call an articulating link piston. Basically what this is for thermal expansion. Is it necessary? Probably not. It's certainly an enhancement. But if you also notice, they actually use gas rings on this as well. The one thing that the gas rings does is it decreases the amount of gas you need to blow the operating rod back. If you look at a rifle like an AK-47 where there's no gas rings, you have to over-gas it because a lot of gas will escape around the edges of the piston. So you have to have that extra gas in to knock it out. Well, if you have it the expansion chamber sealed up, it will require less gas to operate. And this comes right off. And this is the version that's being used now, whether it be in the commercial LE1020 or the advanced piston carbines that they sell for military use. Barrel is the same. If you also notice the upper receiver itself, the original one utilized the ringlets for swing swivels. That was changed in favor of having QD slots on the right and left side. So you're able to have the QD points. Giving you a little bit of information about the upper receivers. It starts off as a single forging of 7075 T6 aircraft grade aluminum, and a very long machining process to get it to where it is. You also see on the final version, you have all the rails that are marked. This again was a prototype. This had no marks on it at all. Again, this is a very valuable rifle to me because, again, so far as I know, this was the only one that ever left Colt. So this is the current version. They're still not very prevalent to get a hold of. Occasionally you'll see some on Gunbroker, but it's not one that you see a lot of production of. Its success, I do believe there's been a couple of very small military sales of it. For as far as its military use, I do believe it was a little too late compared to all the other ones. When it came out, they were saying it was going to be a HK416 killer. Was it? I don't think so at all. I think throughout the years between the release of the HK416 and the release of this, the HK has developed a very good combat record. There's been issues with the HK416 as well, and a lot of those stem from external piston guns in this configuration. They have to be very heavily overgassed to keep them running properly, and unfortunately when you do that, you knock the hell out of a lot of the internal parts and everything. I know the HK416 has seen some failures with that. It was pulled out of Dev Group many years ago because of some of those issues. But the Colt piston gun, it was too little too late. If you look at in between the release of the 416 and this one, you look at incredible guns. The POF system came out right around the same time the HK did, which has proven to be an excellent piston system. And now we'll look at primary weapons. You'll look at LMT's MRP piston system, which also has seen a lot of service. Anybody who goes to buy the Colt gun, you're the first guy on the block. Is it a good gun? Oh, I certainly believe it's a good gun. It was very interesting just seeing the politics that went into it. That you only would have saw if you were at Colt. I do remember being in those days that all the salespeople, they were on Colt executives to release it just because of the demand. They knew they would sell them. The decision, Colt in the last, well, probably I would say since 2004, 2005. Since that time period, the company has changed a lot. It went from a design mecca to merely a mass production facility. The R&D pretty much halted. Very little R&D was ever done. They basically were living off the M4 production. And the production that they were living off of was U.S. military. They were not selling a lot of guns to the commercial area, and even law enforcement was taking a backstand to it. You certainly understand the desire for all the military weapons as well as it being a national priority. At the same time, without having any kind of balance there, Colt had lost a lot of support because Colt wasn't supporting them. At that same time also was when the entire revolver section was shut down, and more was put into rifle production, and Colt dropped all their revolvers, and that was also the time where it went with Colt's manufacturing and Colt's defense. The two companies split, and when you were in the factory, you would see one side of the company was Colt Manufacturing, which was towards the front, and the whole back was Colt Defense, was all M4 production. So, and where we're at right now is with Colt's lack of military contracts. They gear up more of their commercial. The prices are finally actually down where somebody could actually afford an LE6920. The Colt's prices were always higher. But the story behind the 1020, the entire Colt external piston system is a very unique story. It's one I'm sure you've never heard of, because really, unless you were in the middle of it, you wouldn't really know all the details. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, please click like and please subscribe. Thank you.